Cash Johnny Cane's The Minutiae, starring Vaughn Coovey. Episode 2, Washakie County Commissioner.
Chapter 2. Vaughn Coovey, Washakie County Commissioner, Worland, Wyoming. The first thing they handed him as a new Washakie County Commissioner wasn't a ceremonial pen or a framed photo. It was a 3-inch binder labeled FY Budget Orientation, Commissioner's Edition. Inside, tabs bristled like warning flags. Revenues, expenditures, capital, reserves, debt. The outgoing commissioner, Obadiah Muzz, and the county administrator, Eva Wolfenden, walked him through it page by page in a cramped conference room behind the commissioner's chambers. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and toner. On the wall, framed photographs of past commissions stared down at them, each line of faces representing a different era of hard choices. The overview started simply enough. A chart showed total county revenues for the last decade, a jagged line rising and collapsing in uneven waves. Another chart overlaid that line with the spot prices of oil and gas during the same period. The two graphs moved almost in lockstep. That was the first sobering lesson of county government. Washakie didn't really write its own story. The state's mineral valuation formulas and global energy markets did. Then came the detail that landed hardest. Eva flipped to a section Oriana Blakesley, the county treasurer, had prepared. A breakdown of property tax revenues by class, residential, agricultural, commercial, industrial, mineral. The mineral column dominated the page. In some years, more than half of the county's entire property tax base was tied to oil, gas, and other mineral production. In the good years, mineral valuations inflated like a balloon, and money flooded in. In the bad years, it all seemed to empty out at once. They pointed to the collateral damage, law enforcement budgets growing and shrinking in sync with drilling activity. Road and bridge projects started one year and deferred the next. EMS units trying to cover the same square miles with fewer people and aging vehicles. School capital requests shuffled down the priority list and repackaged the following year under more urgent headings. It dawned on Vaughn that the wildfire crisis he had campaigned on was just one flavor of instability. The real wildfire, the financial one, came back every few years without smoke or sirens. It lived in spreadsheets and valuation notices and state tax bulletins. On paper, the commissioner's job description sounded straightforward. Adopt an annual budget, set priorities, steward the county's long-term health. In reality, he was climbing aboard a county strapped to a roller coaster built miles away in Cheyenne, Denver, and Houston. Somebody would have to find a way to blunt those swings. As of that morning, that somebody was him. He walked out of the orientation with the heavy binder tucked under his arm, and the uneasy sense that the campaign had been the easy part. He wasted no time. At the very next commissioner's regular meeting, tucked between a routine subdivision plat and an equipment surplus item, Vaughn formally requested a multi-year revenue and valuation analysis. The request wasn't casual. It appeared on the agenda under new business, worded with enough specificity that Oriana and the county assessor, Bridger Tully, would know exactly what he needed. 10 years of property tax revenue broken down by class. A separate table showing the mineral portion of that base, oil, gas, and other extractive values, and a year-by-year comparison of department budgets in those same years, with special attention to law enforcement, roads, EMS, and capital reserves. In the days that followed, the courthouse quietly pivoted to gather what he had asked for. Oriana's staff pulled archived tax rolls and annual financial reports, reconstructing the trend lines year by year. In the assessor's office, Bridger and his deputy exported valuation histories from the CAMA system, highlighting when major energy properties had been reappraised or when new wells had come online or gone dark. They crosswalked numbers between offices, ensuring that valuations on one side aligned with revenues on the other. Old notes in the margins explained odd spikes, a one-time pipeline project, a large industrial expansion, a shut-in of several gas fields after a price crash. A week later, 2 ring-bound compilations arrived on Vaughn's desk with neat labels. Treasurer, 10-year revenue trend by class and department. Assessor, 10-year valuation trend, mineral and energy properties. He closed his office door and started reading. The numbers told a story sharper than anything he'd heard over coffee. In one peak year, total property tax revenues reached $9.8 million. 3 years later, after a pronounced dip in energy prices and a statewide revaluation, that number slumped to $6.1 million. On a separate sheet, someone had helpfully highlighted the sheriff's budget during those same years. During the downturn, it had been trimmed by nearly 15%, deferred fleet replacements, postponed hiring of 2 patrol deputies and training budgets, shaved down to the bone. Another chart tracked the capital reserves dedicated to roads and bridges. In the good years, the balance crept above $1.2 million, enough to fully fund overlays and structure repairs. In the lean years, it drained almost to zero, leaving projects carried forward as a depressing list of unfunded needs. He traced the columns with his finger. It wasn't just that the county had good years and bad years. It was that the bad years always seemed to come just after the county had committed to new obligations in the good ones. Crews were hired. Equipment was purchased. Programs were started. Then the floor dropped. On a yellow legal pad, he scribbled simple words. It's not a budget problem, it's a structural problem. Underneath, he added a second line. We don't control the roller coaster, but we choose whether we strap the ambulance to it. It was the first time he saw the problem clearly. The volatility was not a surprise. The county had lived with it for decades. The surprise was how little had been done to separate essential services from the swings. He closed the binder and realized that if he wanted to change that, he would need to build consensus and rules from scratch. That meant putting everyone who lived on the front lines of those cuts in the same room. He called it a budget workshop, but what he was really convening was a triage council. Under Wyoming's open meetings laws, the gathering had to be noticed, even if no formal action would be taken. The agenda that went up on the courthouse bulletin board and the county website was simple. Workshop, discussion of revenue volatility and service baselines. On a Tuesday evening, in the commissioner's hearing room with the microphones turned down and the cameras off, Vaughn gathered Oriana Blakesley, Gannon Colby, and Dexter Bray. Along with Avon Holliday, the Roads and Bridges supervisor, and Tovia Thuney, the EMS director. The people whose departments bore the brunt of the swings, Eva Wolfenden, the county administrator, sat quietly along the wall, legal pad ready, there to capture whatever emerged. Vaughn did not lecture. He started with the charts. Projected onto the wall, the decade-long revenue line mocked them, peaks and valleys marching across the years. He asked each department head a practical question. In the worst year on that graph, what did you have to cut that, in your professional judgment, should never have been on the chopping block? The answers came slowly but honestly. The sheriff described reducing overnight patrol coverage in the farthest corners of the county, relying more heavily on call-outs and mutual aid when deputies were already stretched thin. Training days were canceled, and jail maintenance was deferred until things broke. Avon talked about gravel roads that went 1 or 2 winters too long without a proper re-graveling, culverts that weren't replaced until they failed, and bridges that stayed on temporary weight restrictions for years longer than engineers recommended, forcing detours for school buses and grain trucks. Tovia, with eyes tired from years of rotating shifts, explained what it meant to run EMS with fewer full-time paramedics and more part-time coverage. Longer response times in some zones, increased burnout in others, and worn-out ambulances kept in service because replacement purchases had been pushed 1 more year too many times. Oriana, who saw all of it in columns and line items, added a different sort of pain. The slow erosion of trust among staff who watched their positions and tools appear and disappear with each boom and bust, people leaving for more stable counties, institutional knowledge walking out the door with them. Gannon, as clerk, offered a quieter perspective. Elections, public records, minutes, those functions rarely saw sharp swings, but his office absorbed the ripple effects. When other departments were cut, the tension showed up in public meetings, phone calls, and correspondence. The clerk's office became an unofficial pressure valve. They talked for hours. By the end of the workshop, the yellow notepads on the table were filled with lists. Together they sketched out a concept Vaughn had been pushing them toward, a critical service baseline. Not an ideal budget, not even a comfortable one. Just the minimum package of staffing, equipment, and maintenance needed for each department to function safely and lawfully, regardless of whether oil was at $40 or $80. For the sheriff, that baseline meant a specific number of deputies on patrol per shift, a training schedule that met state mandates and safety standards, and a replacement cycle for vehicles that kept them off the shoulder with hoods up. For roads and bridges, it meant funding a defined number of miles of gravel-regravel per year, a basic snow and ice control program, and scheduled structural inspections paired with the most critical replacements. For EMS, it meant 24/7 coverage zones that met response time expectations within reason, a minimum number of paramedics per shift, and a planned rotation for ambulance replacements before catastrophic failures. They didn't settle every detail that night, but they came away with something they had not had before, a collectively agreed-upon floor, a professional line in the sand that said, "Anything below this is not cutting the mustard." Vaughn left the workshop with those lists tucked into a folder labeled Baselines Working Draft. If he could find a way to protect at least that floor from the worst of the swings, then every boom year after that could be argued on top of something solid. The next morning, the courthouse halls were quieter. Regular business resumed: building permits, marriage licenses, vehicle registrations. Behind closed doors, Vaughn went back to the numbers. He invited two people only, Oriana and Bridger Tooley, the treasurer and the assessor, one who tracked the money coming in, the other who tracked the values that generated it. They sat around a small table in Vaughn's office, the blinds half open to the winter light. On the desk lay printouts of revenue trends, the workshop notes from the night before, and his own scribbled idea that refused to go away. Energy Stabilization Fund, codified. They started by defining the problem in their own terms. Oriana confirmed that the county had no formal mechanism for smoothing the mineral revenue swings beyond the general practice of being conservative in good years and hoping for the best in bad ones. Bridger explained how state schedules, production reports, and the industrial appraisal process dictated when those swings hit the county's rolls on a timetable Washakie did not control. Vaughn outlined the concept he had been refining since the workshop. The county would calculate a 5-year rolling average of its mineral-related revenues and consider that average to be its normal energy income. Each year, they would compare actual mineral revenues to that baseline. If actual revenues came in above the average, the excess would be skimmed into a restricted energy stabilization fund. If actual revenues fell below the average, the gap, up to a defined limit, could be filled by drawing from that fund, but only to protect the agreed-upon critical service baselines. He was careful to stress what the fund would not be. It would not be a slush fund. It would not be a general savings account for pet projects. It would be chained by ordinance to the sheriff's operations, road and bridge maintenance, EMS, jail operations, fire protection, and critical school facility repairs. Oriana listened with a treasurer's skepticism and a citizen's hope. She pointed out that Wyoming law placed limits on how much could be held in reserves and how those reserves needed to be classified. The fund would need to be structured in a way that complied with the state's budgeting statutes and reporting requirements. Bridger thought through the practical mechanics. How early in the budget cycle they could reasonably estimate mineral revenues for the upcoming year, how conservative those estimates should be, how to document the 5-year average so that future boards could not quietly redefine it to suit short-term pressures. The more they talked, the clearer the contours became. The fund would have its own line in the budget, its own account in the county's financial system, and its own policy governing deposits and withdrawals. Both the treasurer and the commissioners would be bound by that policy. In the end, all three came to the same conclusion. If they wanted this to survive beyond the current board, beyond Vaughn himself, it couldn't be a handshake or an informal practice. It needed to be written down as law. Vaughn closed the discussion with a simple next step. Bridger would schedule a meeting with Henry Huxley Holden, the county attorney, to begin drafting a formal ordinance establishing the Energy Stabilization Fund, incorporating Oriana's statutory concerns and the baseline concept the workshop had created. County government moved slowly by design, but once Henry started typing, momentum had a way of building. Creating a new fund was one thing. Persuading people to trust it was another. Under Wyoming law, an ordinance or resolution of this kind required a public process. Vaughn knew that if the Energy Stabilization Fund was going to survive its first test, the people most affected by it needed to understand it before they saw it as a line in the budget. He asked Gannon to reserve the district courtroom for a weeknight workshop and to publish a notice in the legal section of the local newspaper, as well as on the county website. The agenda was blunt: public workshop, proposal for Energy Stabilization Fund, and critical service baselines. Letters and emails were sent out, as well as individual invitations, too. Kai Ochotorena, the mayor of Worland; Oakland Belmudo, the new mayor of Ten Sleep; Bronwyn Pottle Green and Mike Cattermole, the superintendents of the local school districts; Kay Tuffley from the Chamber of Commerce, and David Flint Rowe from the county's Economic Development Authority, along with representatives from the major oil and gas operators active in the county, leaders of the local Ranchers Association, and several business owners who routinely turned up at budget hearings. On the night of the workshop, the courtroom filled in slowly. Jackets creaked against wooden benches. A few people sat with arms folded. Others came with notebooks in hand. On easels at the front of the room, Oriana and Bridger set up large printed charts. Color-coded lines and stacked bars made legible even from the back row. Vaughn did what he always did best. He translated numbers into a story. He walked the room through the past 10 years of the county's financial roller coaster, using the charts Oriana and Bridger held up. He pointed out the specific years where revenues spiked, then collapsed, and what that had meant in practical terms. Fewer patrol cars on back roads, delayed bridge repairs, schools patching roofs instead of replacing them. He made a point again and again that the fund was not a new tax. No mill levies were being added. No special assessments were being proposed. The county was not taking more from anyone. It was simply planning to handle what it already received more predictably. Skepticism surfaced in familiar forms. Some worried aloud about the government hoarding money during good times instead of immediately plowing it into roads and projects. Others, particularly from industry, wanted to be sure the fund would not become a pretext for future tax increases. Vaughn answered those concerns in procedural terms. He explained how the fund's rules would be written into ordinance, how deposits and withdrawals would be reported annually in the budget book, and how any use of the fund would be tied to clearly defined critical service baselines rather than vague notions of need. He was careful to mention that the fund rules would be identical in good years and bad. The same formula would govern deposits and withdrawals regardless of who sat on the commission. Over the course of the evening, the tone in the room shifted. People who had walked in assuming they were about to be asked for more money realized instead that they were being invited into a conversation about stability. Ranchers saw a county less likely to slash road maintenance on the routes they used. School leaders heard a plan that could protect basic facility needs even in lean years, and industry representatives recognized that smoother county finances meant fewer frantic calls for state bailouts and emergency policy changes. The workshop ended not with applause, but with the quieter sign of success. People lingering in the aisles, talking in low tones about if this had existed 5 years ago, and it might actually help. The next step would be less public, but more binding, putting the structure into law. Henry Huxley Holden was not a man given to grand phrases, but he knew how to draft a durable county ordinance. Using input from Vaughn, Oriana, and Bridger, he prepared a resolution titled, "A Resolution Establishing the Washakie County Energy Stabilization Fund and Setting Forth Policies for Its Use." The document did several things, each with its own numbered section. 1. It created the fund as a restricted reserve, separate from the general fund, held by the treasurer in an account designated solely for energy stabilization. 2. It defined the revenue source as the portion of annual mineral-related property tax revenues in excess of a 5-year rolling average calculated according to specified criteria. 3. It sets conditions for deposits requiring that in any year when mineral revenues exceeded the baseline, a stated percentage of that excess must be transferred into the fund before consideration of discretionary capital projects. 4. It established withdrawal rules, allowing the Commission, by majority vote at a noticed public meeting, to appropriate money from the fund only to maintain core baselines for law enforcement, roads and bridges, EMS, jail operations, fire protection, and critical school infrastructure during revenue downturns. 5. It imposed reporting requirements mandating that the fund's balance, deposits, and withdrawals be presented annually in the county's budget book along with narrative explanations. And 6, it protected the baseline lists, incorporating by reference the workshop-developed critical service baselines and requiring that any changes to those baselines be documented and adopted at a public meeting. When the resolution was finally ready, it appeared as a standalone item on the Commissioner's agenda. Copies were made available at the clerk's counter. The hearing was noticed in the usual ways. On the day of the vote, the Commissioner's hearing room felt heavier than usual. County staff filled the side chairs. A few of the same faces from the workshop sat scattered through the audience. As one of 3 commissioners, Vaughn knew the math. He needed at least 2 aye votes for the resolution to pass. His own vote was not in question. The uncertainty lay with his colleagues. Commissioner Josiah Garrick, the chair, was a pragmatic man who had spent years fielding complaints about gravel roads and snowplows. Commissioner Prue Paisley, whose family still ran cattle and who remembered what the last downturn had done to their neighbors. The administrator, Ava Wolfenden, summarized the resolution. Henry outlined its legal structure, emphasizing that it complied with statutory reserve limits and that it did not create any new tax authority. Oriana spoke briefly about how the fund would function in the county's financial system and the discipline it would impose on future boards. Public comment was taken. A few citizens rose to repeat concerns about locking up money that could be used immediately for visible needs. Others spoke in cautious support, seeing in the fund a way to keep their essential services intact during the next inevitable slump. The commissioners deliberated. Garrick was torn. He understood the logic of smoothing out the revenue roller coaster. He had lived through its worst drops. But he also drove the same roads as everyone else and saw potholes and sagging shoulders now. He worried aloud that putting money aside in the name of future stability would be hard to defend to people watching graders limp by on bald tires. Paisley's reasoning cut a different way. She carried a recent memory of a relative's ranch almost going under when the last bust hit, and county support services were cut right when they needed them most. For her, the notion of protecting basic services from the swings felt less like hoarding and more like finally acting like grown-ups. In the end, the vote was called. Vaughn and Paisley voted aye. Garrick, after a pause that would be remembered, voted no, explaining that while he respected the effort, he wanted more immediate attention to roads before committing to long-term structure. 2-1. The motion carried. The resolution was signed by all 3 commissioners and by Gannon Colby as county clerk, assigned a resolution number, and entered into the county records. The ink itself didn't change anything, but it meant that from that moment forward, the Energy Stabilization Fund existed not as an idea, but as a legal obligation. The next morning, Oriana opened a new account in the county's financial system and labeled it in the dry language of accounting, Energy Stabilization Reserve, restricted. Gannon updated the county's budget policy manual to include the fund, inserting paragraphs that future clerks and commissioners would read long after the current board was gone. In the next budget book, a new page would appear, explaining in plain language what the fund was for and how it worked. For the first time since taking office, Vaughn felt that Washakie County had moved one step off the roller coaster and onto something like a rail. The fund did not transform the county overnight. There were no ribbon cuttings for stability. Instead, the change showed up in small procedural ways. At the next budget kickoff meeting, Department heads received a new packet that included not only their historical expenditures, but also a summary of the Energy Stabilization Fund's rules and the critical service baselines they had helped write. When they filled out their budget requests, they did so with a clearer understanding of which parts of their operations were considered non-negotiable and which were still subject to the boom and bust tides. In the Treasurer's office, monthly reports began to include a line showing the current balance of the Energy Stabilization Fund, even when that balance was zero. On a whiteboard behind Oriana's desk, someone drew a small box labeled ESF and began tracking deposits and withdrawals in erasable marker as the year progressed. Vaughn watched all of this with a commissioner's mix of involvement and restraint. He attended budget work sessions and asked pointed questions when it looked like someone was trying to shoehorn a discretionary project under the fund's protective umbrella. He insisted that withdrawals, when they eventually came, be justified with reference back to the baselines. But he also knew when to step back. The day-to-day application of the fund, the muscle memory of it, had to live in the treasurer's spreadsheets and the department head's planning documents, not solely in his speeches. Once he was satisfied that the machinery was turning, policies updated, staff trained, reporting in place, he let himself look up and out again. The fund protected essential services from the worst of the mineral swings, but it did nothing to change the underlying composition of the tax base. The county still rode the same roller coaster. It had simply bolted a safety bar across its most important passengers. That wasn't enough for him. If Washakie County wanted less whiplash, it needed more than guardrails. It needed new sources of revenue that did not rise and fall with each drilling program. Vaughn began sketching on yet another legal pad, this time under the heading, Diversification, Tax Base. He met with David Flint Rowe, the director of the local Economic Development Authority, and Kay Tuffley, the chair of the Chamber of Commerce, at a diner in Worland, spreading out zoning maps between coffee cups. They talked about what Washakie already had, rail access, highway corridors, proximity to the Bighorn Mountains, and what it lacked, certain types of light manufacturing, value-added ag processing, recreation infrastructure that could capture more of the tourist traffic passing through. From those conversations grew a loose but deliberate plan. He asked staff to identify parcels of land already zoned appropriately for industrial or commercial use with good access to existing utilities and transportation routes. Those parcels were compiled into a simple opportunity map that the county could hand to prospective businesses. He worked with the planning office to review permitting timelines and identify the choke points that frustrated applicants. Without sacrificing basic safety and environmental standards, they looked for ways to consolidate inspections, standardize checklists, and post clear guidance online so that people knew up front what was required. He, David, and Kay worked together to shape modest but targeted incentive tools the county could legally deploy, temporary waivers of certain local fees for qualifying projects, participation in infrastructure upgrades that would serve both new and existing businesses, and letters of support for state and federal grant applications. Special focus went to sectors that would anchor themselves in the county regardless of oil prices. A small ag processing facility that turned local crops into shelf-stable products. A light manufacturing outfit that produced equipment parts, shipping statewide. Outfitters and lodging businesses that linked their fortunes not to mineral cycles, but to snowpack and trail conditions in the Bighorns. Vaughn saw to it that tourism stakeholders were brought into the same room as the economic development professionals. Outfitters, moteliers, and cafe owners from 10 Sleep and Worland sat alongside bankers and ranchers, mapping out how to make the county a more compelling stop rather than just a place people passed through. None of this work promised a dramatic short-term payoff. New businesses took time to recruit and longer still to show up as meaningful entries on the tax rolls. But each time a new venture filed its paperwork at the clerk's office, each time a new piece of equipment appeared on the assessor's list under a non-mineral category, Vaughn noted it. Every small storefront, every modest workshop that opened its doors meant one more thread in a broader tapestry. The goal was not to replace mineral revenue. That would have been folly. The goal was to dilute it enough that, over time, the peaks and valleys softened, and the county's fate was less tethered to someone else's rig schedule. While that long play unfolded slowly, the more immediate work of managing valuations still happened somewhere else, in Cheyenne. For all the spreadsheets and workshops and local initiatives, Vaughn could not escape one stubborn fact. The numbers that ultimately mattered, the taxable values on which his county's revenues were based, were stamped with the seal of the Wyoming Department of Revenue. Oil and gas valuations were calculated under statewide formulas based on production reports and appraisal schedules maintained by state staff. The timing and methodology of those valuations were not suggestions, they were rules. Washakie could plan and cushion, but it could not dictate when the next swing would hit. If he wanted real predictability, he needed a better relationship with the people who wrote those rules. So when the statewide county commissioners' conference rolled around again in Cheyenne, Vaughn didn't treat it as just another networking obligation. He treated it as a mission. He registered for sessions that most people skipped, deep dives into tax policy, panels on state-county fiscal relations, and technical updates from the Department of Revenue. He sat near the front, took notes, and asked questions that were more specific than the usual. How will this affect us? He framed his questions around the practical needs of budgeting, forecast windows, notification timelines, scenario planning. On the margins of the conference, over coffee refills and hallway conversations, he quietly gathered allies. Commissioners from Campbell, Converse, Sublette, and other energy-heavy counties who nodded along when he described the whiplash their budgets had suffered. They had their own stories of sheriff's departments shrunk overnight, road crews sent home, and capital projects mothballed after valuations plunged. When the Department of Revenue presenters finished a breakout session on industrial appraisal schedules, Vaughn stayed on afterwards and introduced himself to the key players. Rex Yoxall, the director of the department, Capri Oakenfold, head of the property tax division, and Opaline Jelinek, the industrial appraisal manager who oversaw mineral valuations. He did not try to negotiate policy on the spot. Instead, he made a simple, procedural ask. A formal meeting the next day to discuss ways the department could provide counties with better advance notice of major valuation swings and more useful forecast data. By 8:59 the following morning, he was sitting at one end of a polished conference table in the department's headquarters, a one-page handout in front of each state official summarizing his proposal. A wall clock ticked softly over their heads. Someone slid a carafe of coffee toward the center of the table. The meeting was not dramatic. No one pounded the table. Instead, they walked through the realities of the system as it existed. Rex Yoxall and Capri Oakenfold explained the constraints under which they operated. Statutory deadlines for issuing valuations, confidentiality requirements around company-level data, and the complexity of modeling commodity prices years in advance. They were sympathetic to counties' frustrations, but their first obligation was to accuracy and uniformity across the state. Vaughn responded in equally procedural terms. He did not ask them to change how they calculated values. Instead, he asked them to consider how and when they communicated with counties about those calculations. He laid out two concrete requests. One, that the department produce and share a medium-range valuation forecast for mineral properties by county based on existing production trends and price scenarios, with clear caveats about uncertainty, but in time for counties to use those forecasts in their preliminary budgeting. And two, that the department establish an early warning protocol under which counties would be notified whenever a forthcoming valuation change, due to either price shifts or reappraisal, was likely to move their mineral base by more than a defined percentage. He stressed that this was not just about Washakie. The same tool could help any county with heavy mineral exposure. Better forecasts and earlier warnings would allow counties to adjust budgets calmly rather than scramble after the fact. From the department's perspective, that would mean fewer emergency calls to state legislators, fewer last-minute pleas for state aid, and less political heat when the numbers came out. For an hour, they batted the ideas back and forth. Capri Oakenfold suggested a pilot program starting with a handful of counties that volunteered to participate. Opaline Jelinek explained that while the department could not promise precision in forecasts, her team could likely bracket projected values within reasonable ranges if they were clear about assumptions. Rex Yoxall listened, occasionally asking how counties would actually use the information. Vaughn described budget calendars, public hearing schedules, and the way local expectations could be managed if commissioners walked into budget season with a realistic range instead of blind hope. The meeting ended not with fanfare, but with a handshake and a commitment. The department would develop a prototype forecasting and early warning system, test it with the counties most eager to participate, and refine it over the next cycle. The price of oil would still rise and fall, indifferent to any conversation in Cheyenne. But if the pilot worked, Washakie County would not be caught flat-footed when it did. Back home, the changes came encoded in spreadsheets and email bulletins rather than headlines. The Department of Revenue launched its pilot quietly, sending quarterly valuation forecasts to participating counties. Each report laid out current mineral valuation by county, a projected range for the next 2 fiscal years under conservative, moderate, and optimistic price assumptions, and notes on any upcoming reappraisal events or known production changes that could significantly move the needle. Alongside those forecasts came a new kind of message: early warning notices. When internal models showed that a county's mineral valuation was likely to drop or spike beyond a specific percentage, the department sent an alert months before the official numbers were certified. For Washakie, that information arrived just early enough to matter. In the next boom year, the forecasts flagged a probable surge in valuations driven by expanded production in one of the county's major fields. As revenues came in above the 5-year baseline, the Treasurer's Office, guided by the ordinance, transferred the required portion of the surplus into the Energy Stabilization Fund. The balance, once a blank line, now showed a meaningful figure. Road crews got their scheduled overlays that year. The sheriff replaced high-mileage vehicles on time. EMS refreshed some aging equipment. But just as important, the commission resisted the temptation to permanently expand baseline staffing in ways that would be unsustainable when the inevitable correction arrived. 2 years later, a different set of department forecasts and early warning notices told a less pleasant story. Production slowed, prices softened. A reappraisal of key mineral properties was going to bring valuations down sharply. Armed with that notice months in advance, Vaughn and his colleagues built their budget with their eyes wide open. They did not pretend the revenue dip would magically reverse. They did not promise expansions they could not afford. Instead, they activated the second half of the system they had built. At a noticed public meeting, the commission voted to appropriate a portion of the Energy Stabilization Fund to backfill the shortfall in critical service lines only. The sheriff kept his night patrol. Avon's road crews continued their minimum miles of gravel re-gravel. Tovia's EMS coverage zones remained intact. There were still cuts elsewhere. Discretionary capital projects were delayed. Some vacant positions in less critical areas stayed unfilled. A few community grant programs saw temporary reductions. But what did not happen was just as important as what did. There were no emergency tax hikes sprung on residents mid-year, no sudden layoff notices for deputies or EMTs, no hurried crisis press conferences at which the commission announced that roads would not be plowed past certain points. Instead, people watched as the county moved through the downturn with a kind of measured steadiness they weren't used to. 5 years later, the system had finally seen a full boom-bust cycle. 1 fat year and 1 lean year had both come and gone under the rules Vaughn had helped write. The state, too, could see the difference in aggregate. Counties using the department's forecasts and early warning tools and pairing them with their own stabilization mechanisms showed fewer emergency pleas for supplemental appropriations. Reserve balances held steadier. Long-term capital plans survived swings that would once have shredded them. In Washakie, it showed up in quieter ways. Road graders still moving at dawn, school roofs patched when needed rather than when possible, deputies still parked on lonely highways at night. Vaughn took those sights personally. He knew the paperwork behind every one of them. For Vaughn Coovey, the success of the stabilization effort was both satisfying and unsettling. On the satisfying side, he had done what he set out to do. He had taken a county that had grown accustomed to lurching from feast to famine and given it a framework for riding out the storms with less panic. He had helped turn ad hoc reactions into predictable processes. On the unsettling side, he realized that the work had changed him. The hours spent in budget workshops and Cheyenne conference rooms had shifted his mental horizon. He began to think less in terms of single budget year fixes and more in terms of frameworks that could be replicated, adapted, and scaled. He saw how a single county's practical solution could inform state policy and vice versa. Every time he walked past the commissioner's dais and saw the bound budget books lined up on a shelf, he knew that his fingerprints were on more than just that year's numbers. They were on the rules that would govern budgets long after his term ended. As his time as commissioner drew toward its natural close, he found that his internal compass was no longer pointing solely to the county seat. The legislative sessions he had visited in Cheyenne, the hearings he had testified at, the relationships he had formed with lawmakers and agency heads, all of it made the state capitol feel less like a distant power and more like the next room down the hall. He did not frame it as ambition at first. He framed it as trajectory. If he could help one county build a better way to handle volatility, what might he be able to do at the level where the formulas themselves were written? Those thoughts lingered as an election cycle approached. Open seats in the State House rarely stayed open for long. But when one did, in a district that covered the communities whose budgets he had been trying to protect, the decision he had been quietly turning over for months came into focus. The campaign for the State House did not feel like a break from his work as commissioner. It felt like a different form of the same conversation. He filed his candidacy with the Secretary of State's Elections Division, filling out the same forms he had watched others sign in the clerk's office. Financial disclosure packets followed. Party meetings were attended. His name appeared on primary ballots, then general election ballots, printed on paper he recognized from the same vendor that supplied county ballots. Days became a blur of county fairs, town halls, kitchen table visits, and courthouse steps. People who had first met him as the mayor of 10 Sleep or as a county commissioner now asked him what he wanted to do in Cheyenne. He talked less about titles and more about systems, about building frameworks that helped rural counties survive market swings, about modernizing elections and records, about protecting public lands and local economies in the same breath. The commissioner's schedule didn't pause for the campaign. He still attended meetings, signed minutes, and handled constituent calls. At times, the two roles bled together. One day he might be finalizing a budget amendment. The next he'd be standing under a shade tent at a fairground, explaining what that amendment meant to someone who had never set foot in the courthouse. When the votes were counted and the canvass completed, the results came in not as fireworks, but as the calm reading of numbers. The voters had given him their trust again, this time for a different office. Certification followed in orderly steps. The clerk of state recorded the outcome. Orientation packets from the legislature arrived in his mailbox, thick with rules, committee structures, and ethics requirements. At the Capitol, a cheerful orientation staffer named Kismet Pepperday walked him through the new member materials, pointing out deadlines and procedures with the easy fluency of someone who had shepherded many freshmen before him. An oath date was set. Soon enough, Vaughn found himself taking that oath in the rotunda of the Capitol in Cheyenne, the echo of his words bouncing off old stone. The new title came printed on official stationery and on the nameplate that would sit on a desk in a room miles from the Washakie County Courthouse. Wyoming State Representative, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Back in Worland, he packed his office slowly. The binders on revenue volatility, the ordinance establishing the Energy Stabilization Fund, the workshop notes with department heads' handwriting in the margins, all of it was carefully filed, labeled, and left where the next commission could find it. His own belongings fit in a handful of boxes, framed photos, a coffee mug from 10 Sleep, a worn leather briefcase that had seen countless budget hearings and late-night drives. As he carried the last box down the courthouse steps, he glanced once more at the building that had been his base. He realized that over the previous few years, he had spent so many days at legislative hearings and agency meetings in Cheyenne that the capital already felt strangely familiar. The road between Worland and Cheyenne had become routine. Now it would become home. He set the box into the back of his vehicle, closed the tailgate, and allowed himself a small, private smile. Washakie County would move forward with the systems they had built. His job now was to see how far those systems and the mindset behind them could reach in the wider arena of state law.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to tune in next week for a brand new episode. Bye-bye.